3 luxury neighborhoods went dark, and everyone said it was my fault. At 11:47 that night, 3 luxury neighborhoods around Lake Hollow went completely dark. Security gates froze, alarms screamed, and within minutes 911 callers were blaming me, the rancher who had just inherited 6,000 acres. By sunrise, the news called me reckless. What nobody knew was that I hadn't shut the power off to punish anyone. I shut it off because something buried beneath my father's ranch was about to turn a quiet Texas hillside into a disaster. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized the blackout wasn't the real story. The lie underneath it was. Before we get into it, if you enjoy stories about ranch life, property rights, and ordinary people standing their ground with patience, evidence, and common sense, take a second to subscribe. There are plenty more stories like this, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next one. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the lights disappeared from 3 of the wealthiest neighborhoods surrounding Lake Hollow. 1 second, the hills shimmered with waterfront mansions, illuminated boat docks, and perfectly landscaped streets. The next, everything went black. Security gates froze halfway open. Private marina lights blinked out. Luxury homes vanished into darkness. Then the alarms started. Backup systems screamed across the valley like hundreds of wounded animals. Within seconds, emergency dispatchers were drowning in calls. My gate won't open. The neighborhood's completely dark. My elderly father is on oxygen. Someone shut down the power. The first sheriff's deputies rolled toward the developments before midnight, their red and blue lights flashing across miles of expensive lakefront property that suddenly looked helpless without electricity. I watched all of it from the ridge overlooking my ranch. 6,000 acres had taught me something city people rarely understood. Darkness itself isn't dangerous. Panic is. My name is Grant Holloway. I'm 58 years old, and until 4 months ago, I'd spent most of my career designing, inspecting, and repairing electrical transmission systems across Texas and New Mexico. When high-voltage corridors failed, companies called engineers like me before they called politicians. Because electricity doesn't negotiate. It follows physics, and physics doesn't care how much money you've invested in a luxury neighborhood. Across Lake Hollow, flashing emergency vehicles multiplied as deputies tried to reach neighborhoods whose electronic gates refused to cooperate. Residents stood in driveways holding expensive flashlights that barely cut through the darkness. Some pointed toward my ranch. Even from over a mile away, I could hear the shouting. They already knew where to place the blame. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. I answered. This is Grant. A woman didn't even introduce herself. You shut our power off! Before I could respond, another voice shouted somewhere behind her. Tell him people are trapped inside the marina gate. Then the line went dead. 30 seconds later, another call arrived. Then another. Then another. Most weren't asking questions. They were making accusations. Around midnight, my television, still running quietly in Ponce, the old ranch house, interrupted regular programming with breaking local coverage. A helicopter camera hovered above the blacked-out neighborhoods while the reporter spoke with practiced urgency. Authorities are investigating a widespread outage affecting 3 Lake Hollow communities. Witnesses claim the interruption may be connected to ongoing disputes involving nearby ranch owner Grant Holloway. Connected. Interesting word. Not confirmed. Not proven. Just connected. By 1 a.m., social media had already convicted me. Some posts called me reckless. Others demanded criminal charges. One resident claimed I'd held an entire community hostage. None of them knew what had actually happened. Sheriff Ben Walker called shortly after 1 in the morning. Unlike everyone else, he sounded tired instead of angry. Grant. Ben. I've got half the county asking whether you intentionally shut down the South Corridor. I figured they would. A long pause followed. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered. "Did you?" I looked through the kitchen window toward the dark shoreline. From there, I could normally see reflections dancing across the lake from dozens of waterfront homes. Tonight, there was almost nothing, just emergency lights. "No," I answered calmly. "I shut down something, but not for the reason people think." Another silence. Ben had known me for nearly 20 years. We'd hunted together more than once after deer season opened. He also knew I'd spent decades making sure electrical systems stayed alive. That made tonight difficult. "If I tell them that," he finally said, "they'll ask why." "They should." "You planning to explain?" "I will." "When?" "When the people asking questions are ready to hear the truth instead of looking for someone to blame." He sighed. "You realize they're calling you the man who blacked out 3 neighborhoods." "I've heard." "You worried about that?" I looked toward the hills where thousands of people were suddenly discovering how quiet a luxury community becomes without electricity. No. Because being hated for one night was a smaller price than attending funerals later. The news helicopters stayed overhead until almost 3 in the morning. Every report repeated the same story. A retired engineer, a massive ranch, 3 powerless neighborhoods. No one asked the question that mattered. Why would someone who spent 35 years protecting electrical systems deliberately destroy one? By sunrise, satellite trucks lined County Road 18 outside my property. Reporters gathered beside the front gate. Camera crews waited for me to come outside. Some residents held homemade signs demanding answers. Others demanded my arrest. One television anchor looked directly into the camera and said, "Many residents believe this blackout was intentional." Belief. Another interesting word. Evidence hadn't entered the conversation yet. I poured a cup of black coffee and sat at my father's old kitchen table. Walter Holloway used to tell me something whenever people rushed to conclusions. The loudest story usually arrives first. The truthful one takes longer. I looked toward the filing cabinet still standing beside the dining room wall. That cabinet contained every easement, survey, inspection report, and utility record my father had collected over 5 decades. Those papers were the reason I wasn't worried, because paperwork remembers things people conveniently forget. The reporters outside wanted a villain. The HOA wanted someone to blame. The homeowners wanted their lights back. But none of them knew that the real story hadn't started with a blackout. It had started 28 days earlier, the night I found fresh trench lines cutting across my late father's ranch. A thunderstorm had rolled across Lake Hollow that evening, knocking down a few tree limbs, but nothing serious. I was making my usual fence inspection before daylight disappeared completely when my ATV headlights caught something that didn't belong. Fresh dirt. Not the shallow grooves left by cattle, not erosion from heavy rain. A straight trench, cleanly cut, running across my south pasture toward the old utility easement my father hadn't used in decades. I shut off the engine. The silence hit immediately. Then I heard it. Diesel engines, low voices, metal striking metal somewhere beyond the cedar trees. Nobody had called me for access. Nobody had requested an easement inspection. Nobody had any legal reason to be digging on Mercer land after dark. I followed the trench another 100 yards until the trees opened into a clearing. Portable floodlights illuminated a work site that shouldn't have existed. 2 contractor trucks, a tracked excavator, cable reels stacked beside an open trench, and halfway buried in the ground sat a brand new electrical switching cabinet wrapped in protective plastic. None of it carried county markings. None of it displayed utility identification. Whoever had organized the job wanted it finished quietly. One of the workers noticed my flashlight. Conversation stopped instantly. Another man killed the excavator. Within seconds, every eye was on me. I stepped over the freshly disturbed soil and looked directly at the foreman. "What utility company are you working for?" Nobody answered. The foreman glanced toward the black SUV parked farther back near the fence. That told me someone else was making the decisions. I asked another question. "Who signed the access permit?" Again, silence. Finally, the foreman removed his hard hat. "Mr. Holloway." He knew exactly who I was. "We're just following instructions." "Whose instructions?" Before he could answer, the driver's door of the black SUV opened. Victoria Langford stepped out. Even standing in wet pasture grass, she looked like she'd walked out of a corporate boardroom instead of onto a ranch. Dark coat, perfect posture, not a speck of mud on her boots. She closed the umbrella behind her and offered a practiced smile. "Mr. Holloway, you work late." I could say the same. Her smile never moved. "We're conducting routine infrastructure modernization." I looked past her toward the trench. "On my property?" "The corridor already exists. So does my ownership." That was the first crack in her confidence. Barely noticeable. Just enough to tell me she hadn't expected me to arrive before the work finished. I pointed toward the switching cabinet. "What exactly are you installing?" She answered without looking at it. "Updated utility equipment." "Authorized by who?" "Our legal department has been coordinating with the appropriate parties." That wasn't an answer. It was something lawyers say when they hope specifics never become necessary. I folded my arms. "I didn't ask about your legal department. I asked who gave you permission to dig on my ranch." For the first time, she hesitated. Only a second. But I spent 35 years sitting across conference tables from utility executives trying to explain why projects had gone wrong. People telling the truth usually answer quickly. People protecting liability choose words carefully. Victoria was choosing every word. "The existing easement," she finally said, "allows certain improvements." "Show me." She blinked. "The paperwork." "I'd like to see the easement that authorizes commercial excavation after dark." Behind us, one of the contractors quietly began shutting down another machine. Another started loading equipment back onto a trailer. Nobody had told them to stop. They were stopping because the landowner had shown up asking questions they couldn't answer. Victoria noticed it too. "There's no reason for this conversation to become confrontational." "It isn't." I kept my voice even. "It's becoming documented." That landed harder than an argument would have. Her eyes shifted toward the workers, then back to me. "We can discuss everything tomorrow, no." I pointed at the trench crossing my pasture. "We're discussing why it's here tonight." She didn't respond. Instead, she nodded once toward the foreman. Within moments, engines started again. Not to continue digging, but to leave. The excavator climbed onto its trailer. Floodlights went dark one by one. The entire operation packed up in less than 10 minutes. As Victoria walked back toward her SUV, she paused beside me. "My advice, Mr. Holloway." She spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "Don't make assumptions until you understand the whole system." I met her eyes. "My father taught me something better." She waited. "If somebody starts working after midnight on land they don't own." I looked down at the fresh trench cutting across generations of Holloway property. The assumptions usually make themselves. She climbed into the SUV without another word. The convoy disappeared through the ranch gate. I stayed there alone beside the trench. The fresh soil bothered me, not because it crossed my land, because of the direction. It wasn't heading toward the neighborhoods. It was heading toward the abandoned utility corridor my father had insisted on keeping every maintenance record for until the day he died. By the time I walked back into the ranch house, there was only one place left to look. My father's office. Because if that easement truly authorized what I'd just seen, Walter Holloway would have left the proof behind. And if it didn't, someone had just buried the first piece of a very expensive lie. I unlocked my father's office before sunrise. Walter Holloway believed paperwork deserved more respect than opinions. Every survey, deed, inspection report, and easement agreement was filed by year, then by subject, all in the same oak cabinet he'd used for nearly 40 years. Most people inherit land. I inherited records. I pulled the folder labeled South Utility Easement and spread the documents across his desk. The original agreement was dated 1974. It granted a narrow right-of-way to the County Electric Cooperative. Purpose: limited agricultural distribution, maximum service classification, ranch operations, water pumps, 2 residences, and maintenance buildings. Nothing else. No commercial distribution, no high-capacity switching equipment, no underground transfer station, certainly no authority to expand without written consent from the property owner. I read the language twice, then a third time. Victoria Langford hadn't stretched the truth. She'd stepped completely outside it. I grabbed my phone and called the only man I trusted to verify what I suspected. Ray Collins answered on the second ring. "You sound awake. I've been awake for an hour. You still keeping that old thermal scanner?" A pause. "Grant, what did you find?" "Bring it." He arrived less than 40 minutes later in the same white pickup he'd driven since retirement. Ray had spent 38 years maintaining transmission corridors across central Texas. He didn't waste words, and he didn't impress easily. We drove straight to the south pasture. The trench was still there. So were the fresh tire tracks. Ray crouched beside the new switching cabinet and ran his hand along the metal housing. "That's brand new," I figured. He opened his equipment case and powered on the thermal scanner. The display stabilized. His expression changed immediately. "That's not right." He held the screen toward me. Even without opening the cabinet, the buried conduit beneath the pasture glowed bright orange. Heat, continuous electrical load, far more than a rural easement should ever be carrying. Ray checked again using an electromagnetic field meter. The numbers climbed rapidly. He lowered the device and looked toward the lake. "Grant." "What?" "This isn't feeding cattle pumps." "I know. It's not feeding one ranch either." That sentence settled over us harder than I expected. Because once you understand electrical systems, load tells a story. And this corridor was carrying far too much of it. We followed the easement nearly half a mile toward the shoreline. The farther we walked, the newer everything became. Fresh grounding rods, modern conduit, concrete pads poured within the last few years. Someone had quietly upgraded the corridor piece by piece. Every improvement looked expensive. Every improvement looked deliberate. None of it appeared anywhere in my father's files. Ray stopped beside a weathered utility marker. "I installed one of these back in the 90s. He pointed toward the newer conduit running beside it. "That wasn't here." "You sure?" I'd bet my pension. I photographed everything. Every cabinet, every junction, every fresh trench, every missing permit marker. By noon, my phone rang. "Victoria Langford." I let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Holloway." "Victoria, I hope we can clear up last night's misunderstanding." There wasn't one. I assure you there was. I looked across the pasture, where Ray was measuring another section of buried line. "You had contractors digging on my ranch. The work benefits the surrounding communities." "That's not what I asked." A brief silence. Then her voice became smoother. "The infrastructure falls within an existing corridor. So does my ownership." Another pause. "I think this situation deserves a private conversation. It deserves documentation." Her tone cooled immediately. I'd advise against creating unnecessary conflict. I'd advise against burying expensive equipment where your paperwork doesn't reach. The line went silent. Then she ended the call without another word. Ray walked back, carrying a folded notebook. You're not going to like this. He pointed toward the thermal readings we'd collected. They increase every quarter mile. What does that mean? He looked past me toward the expensive homes barely visible beyond the lake. It means demand is building. From where? I don't know yet. He folded the notebook shut. But I know one thing. This line wasn't upgraded for a ranch. I stared across the water. The rooftops of Lake Hollow shimmered in the afternoon sun. Private docks, luxury homes, boat lifts, perfectly trimmed shoreline. Suddenly, they looked different. Not because of what I could see, because of what I couldn't. Somewhere beneath my father's ranch, hidden under legal language nobody expected anyone to read, was an electrical system carrying far more power than it had any right to. And if Ray was correct, the people living around that lake had no idea their entire community depended on infrastructure that shouldn't legally exist. I slipped the original easement back into its folder. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I wasn't investigating trespassing anymore. I was investigating an entire system, and systems always leave records. The only question now was whether those records were sitting in a courthouse, or buried somewhere people hoped nobody would ever think to look. The next morning, I drove straight to the Kerr County Records Office. I wasn't looking for headlines. I was looking for signatures. County clerks don't care about neighborhood politics. They care about recorded documents, filing dates, and property descriptions. If someone had legally expanded the easement across my ranch, there would be a paper trail. There wasn't. I spent nearly 3 hours comparing recorded plats with the easement my father had signed in 1974. Every filing matched Walter Holloway's copy. The corridor had never been widened. The permitted electrical classification had never changed. No amended agreement, no commercial authorization, no consent from my family, which meant every new piece of infrastructure Ray and I had documented existed outside the recorded easement. That wasn't a disagreement. That was a legal problem. Instead of driving home, I called Nathan Pierce. Nathan specialized in land rights litigation. Ranchers hired him when pipelines crossed fences they shouldn't, or developers discovered property lines too late. He met me that afternoon at the ranch house. I spread every photograph across the kitchen table. Thermal scans, survey maps, the original easement, fresh trench photos. Nathan read quietly for almost 20 minutes. Finally, he leaned back. They're expecting you to sue. I figured, don't. That caught my attention. You don't think we have a case? He smiled slightly. I think we have something much more valuable. He tapped the easement agreement. You own the clock. I frowned. They're expanding active infrastructure before they secure legal authority. He picked up another photograph. If this line is carrying commercial electrical loads, regulators will care. He pointed toward another document. So will the Utility Commission, then another. So will insurance carriers. He looked directly at me. The HOA is expecting a courtroom fight. They're not expecting an audit. That was the moment our strategy changed. Nathan didn't prepare a lawsuit. He prepared notification packets. Every package contained the same evidence: original easement, current survey, photographs, thermal readings, a sworn statement that excavation had occurred without landowner approval. One packet went to the State Utility Commission, another to the Regional Wildfire Authority, another to the Electric Cooperatives Compliance Office, another to the County Land Use Division. We weren't accusing anyone of a crime. We were asking regulators one simple question: does this infrastructure match the recorded easement? Questions are often more dangerous than accusations. because government agencies are required to answer them. Late that afternoon, my phone rang again. Victoria Langford. This time, her voice sounded warmer, almost friendly. Mr. Holloway, I'd like to meet. I'm listening. I think we've reached a point where everyone would benefit from a practical solution. I already have one. And what would that be? The recorded easement. Silence. Then she tried another direction. Our developers recognize your family's long history here. I almost laughed. The day before, she'd hidden contractors on my ranch. Now she was honoring family history. We're prepared to discuss compensation. What kind of compensation? 7 figures. She let the number hang there. Enough money to buy a larger ranch. Enough money to tempt almost anyone. In her mind, this was still a business negotiation. I looked toward my father's office. Walter Holloway had never measured land by its market value. He measured it by whether he could still recognize it. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'm not selling permission for something that may never have been legal. Her tone cooled. This corridor serves thousands of residents. So you keep saying, it would be unfortunate if unnecessary conflict affected those families. There won't be unnecessary conflict. I glanced at the stack of certified mail envelopes waiting beside Nathan. Only necessary paperwork. She didn't answer. The call ended quietly. Nathan looked up from the dining table. She didn't deny anything, did she? No. She just reminded you people depend on the line. He nodded once. That's because she already knows what we're about to discover. 3 days later, the first response arrived. Not from the HOA, from the electric cooperative. The compliance director requested every photograph we'd taken and asked for permission to inspect the south corridor immediately. Nathan smiled as he read the email. Interesting. What? They're asking questions. Isn't that good? It's very good. He folded the letter carefully. Because utilities don't investigate infrastructure they already understand. That afternoon, Ray called from the south pasture. His voice was unusually serious. Grant, what is it? I kept following the line. And? It doesn't stop at Copper Ridge. I stood up immediately. What do you mean? It runs past Copper Ridge, past Juniper Shores, and all the way toward Canyon Reserve. I felt the room go quiet. 3 separate luxury developments surrounded Lake Hollow. 3 separate HOA boards. 3 separate neighborhoods, all connected by one buried corridor crossing my family's ranch. Nathan slowly removed his glasses. I think we just found out why she offered you 7 figures. I stared out the kitchen window toward the lake. This had never been about one HOA trying to stretch an easement. It was about 3 entire communities quietly depending on infrastructure that no recorded document appeared to authorize. And if that secret ever reached the regulators, someone's very expensive business model was about to collapse. The first people to react weren't the regulators. They were the homeowners. Somehow, word spread that I had challenged the utility corridor crossing my ranch. Nobody knew the details, but they knew enough to panic. Within 48 hours, neighborhood forums were full of accusations. That rancher wants money. He's trying to shut down our community. He's holding 3 neighborhoods hostage. No one mentioned easements. No one mentioned unauthorized expansion. No one asked whether the infrastructure had ever been legal in the first place. They only cared that their comfortable lives might be interrupted. By Friday morning, local television was interviewing residents outside the gates of Copper Ridge. One homeowner pointed toward my ranch. We've lived here 12 years. That landowner suddenly decides to make trouble, and now everybody's worried about losing power. I turned the television off. Nathan looked over from the kitchen table. Good. You wanted me to hear that? No, he replied. I wanted you to ignore it. He slid another stack of certified mail receipts toward me. Public opinion changes every hour. Government records don't. That became our strategy. While everyone else argued online, we kept building evidence. Ray and I returned to the corridor with better equipment. We documented every switching cabinet, every fresh concrete pad, every section of newly installed conduit. The thermal readings were climbing. The deeper we followed the corridor toward the lake, the hotter the buried lines became. Ray stopped beside one transformer enclosure, hidden behind cedar trees. This cabinet wasn't designed for ranch service. He pointed toward oversized cooling vents mounted along the housing. Neither was this. I photographed the manufacturer's plate. Commercial distribution transfer equipment. Installed 3 years earlier. No county permit number. No cooperative identification. Nothing connected it to the recorded easement. Back at the ranch house, another email arrived. This one came from Laura Bennett, a senior investigator with the State Utility Compliance Division. She requested access to my property. Not next month. Monday morning. Nathan smiled. They're moving faster than I expected. Is that unusual? It means your evidence made somebody uncomfortable. Before I could answer, another truck pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Ben Walker stepped out. He removed his hat before knocking. I figured we'd better talk face to face. I invited him inside. He looked over the photographs covering my dining table. You've been busy. I've been documenting. Ben picked up one of the thermal images. I'll be honest, Grant. I'm listening. Half the county thinks you're trying to force a payout. I know. The other half thinks the HOA is hiding something. And what do you think? He studied the easement agreement for nearly a minute. I think I don't know enough yet. That was the first honest answer I'd heard all week. I appreciated it. Nathan handed Ben a copy of the recorded easement. The sheriff should probably know what was actually authorized. Ben read the highlighted language. Agricultural electrical service only. No commercial expansion. He looked back at me. If these photographs match what's underground, they do, then somebody's going to have explaining to do. Nathan corrected him. No. Several somebodies. Ben folded the documents carefully. I'll stay out of the civil side. I expected that. But if this turns into unauthorized construction or falsified filings, he left the sentence unfinished. He didn't have to finish it. We all understood. That afternoon, Laura Bennett arrived exactly when she promised. No press, no flashing lights, just a state pickup and a clipboard. She spent nearly 2 hours walking the corridor with Ray and me. She measured cabinet locations, compared GPS coordinates against the recorded easement, photographed every recent installation. She spoke very little. Experienced investigators rarely do. Finally, she stopped beside the newest switching cabinet. Who told you this wasn't supposed to be here? My father. She raised an eyebrow. He kept every easement record. I handed her the original folder. She read quietly, then compared it with the equipment in front of us. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. When was this cabinet installed? I don't know. It isn't reflected anywhere in the recorded documents. She looked toward the lake where expensive rooftops shimmered beyond the trees. Neither are several other things. That was the first time someone outside my circle had confirmed what we already suspected. This wasn't simply a property dispute. It was an undocumented expansion. As Laura packed her files, she turned back toward me. Mr. Holloway. Yes? I'd avoid making any changes to this corridor. I wasn't planning to. Good. She glanced once more at the buried line. Because if these readings are accurate... She paused. The system is already carrying more load, than it was ever designed to handle. After she drove away, Ray remained unusually quiet. Finally, he looked toward the distant neighborhoods surrounding Lake Hollow. "You hear that?" I listened. At first, nothing. Then, a low electrical hum carried across the afternoon air, almost too faint to notice. Ray nodded toward the hidden corridor beneath our feet. "That's not getting quieter. It's getting louder." And for the first time since finding the trench, I stopped worrying about who had built the illegal system. I started worrying about whether it would survive the summer. Because if Laura Bennett was right, the real danger wasn't the paperwork anymore. It was the electricity still flowing through infrastructure that had never been built to carry it. The following week, the temperature climbed past 104 degrees. By noon, Lake Hollow looked exactly the way the developers had advertised it in glossy brochures. Every boat lift was running. Every backyard pool pump hummed. Electric vehicle chargers lined luxury garages. Private marinas kept their circulation systems running around the clock. From a distance, everything looked perfect. Daniel Ortiz knew better. He arrived at my ranch carrying a hard case full of testing equipment and an official authorization letter from the Electric Cooperative's Compliance Division. "I've reviewed the documents you submitted," he said. "I wanted to see the corridor myself." Ray joined us as we walked the south easement. Daniel didn't waste time. He opened one switching cabinet, checked the equipment labels, then frowned. This hardware wasn't installed under agricultural specifications. He measured the incoming load, then measured it again. The second reading was even higher. He looked at me. Whoever upgraded this system expected demand to keep growing. "Can it handle it?" "For now." He didn't sound convinced. We continued toward the shoreline where another concealed cabinet sat behind newly planted cedar trees. Daniel removed the inspection panel. Inside were oversized commercial transfer components. He shook his head slowly. "This equipment belongs in a regional distribution corridor, not on a ranch easement." Ray folded his arms. "So somebody built the right equipment in the wrong place." Daniel nodded, and without the legal authority to do it. Before we returned to the house, Daniel stopped beside one transformer enclosure. He rested his hand against the steel housing for only a second before pulling it away. "Too hot." He raised his thermal camera. The image glowed deep orange. "Cooling systems running continuously." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means demand isn't dropping at night anymore." He stared toward the expensive neighborhoods across the lake. "That's never a good sign." Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed. "Sheriff Ben Walker. You got company." I looked out the front window. 3 black contractor trucks rolled slowly toward my gate. Behind them sat the same black SUV I'd seen the night of the trenching. Victoria Langford stepped out before the trucks had fully stopped. This time, she wasn't smiling. "I need 5 minutes." Nathan Pierce happened to be at the ranch reviewing correspondence. He quietly remained on the porch while I walked to the gate. Victoria glanced toward him. "Our conversation should probably be private." "No. Everything concerning my ranch has become public." She took a slow breath. "I understand you've involved state investigators. They involved themselves. You've created unnecessary attention. I documented unauthorized construction. Those aren't the same thing." Her expression hardened. "Grant." The use of my first name caught my attention immediately. People usually become more familiar when they're losing leverage. "You need to understand what's at stake." "I'm listening." She pointed toward the lake. "Those communities depend on this corridor." "I know. Hundreds of families." "I know. Businesses. I know." She stepped closer. "If regulators overreact," I interrupted her. "Regulators react to facts. Silence." She changed direction. The developers are prepared to increase their offer. I'm not interested. You haven't heard the number. I don't need to. She looked genuinely frustrated for the first time. This isn't about money anymore. No, I agreed. It's about liability. That word landed like a hammer. Her eyes shifted away for a split second. Nathan noticed it too. He quietly walked over carrying a folder. We received another response this morning. Victoria didn't take it. Nathan opened it anyway. State inspectors will begin field verification in 48 hours. He closed the folder. They'd probably like to know why commercial infrastructure was installed outside the recorded easement. Victoria stared at him. You don't understand what shutting this project down would do. Nathan answered before I could. We're not shutting anything down. We're asking government agencies to determine whether it was ever legal. There was nothing she could say to that. Because legality isn't negotiated at a ranch gate. It's documented. She climbed back into the SUV without another word. The trucks followed her down the county road. Ray watched until the dust settled. They're scared. Daniel was still looking at the thermal readings. They should be. He zoomed in on the transformer closest to Copper Ridge. These temperatures have climbed nearly 12% since last week. That bad? Worse. He pointed toward the cooling fans. They haven't cycled off once since I arrived. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Finally, Daniel looked directly at me. If this heat continues, he hesitated. Someone's going to try something desperate. He was right. The next night, my motion cameras activated just after midnight. Floodlights, construction equipment, fresh contractor trucks, not at the original trench, half a mile farther south. I opened the live camera feed. Workers were unloading massive reels of underground electrical cable, portable generators, temporary switching equipment. One contractor directed a trench machine while another unrolled blueprints across the hood of a pickup. The black SUV was parked nearby. Victoria sat inside with a phone pressed against her ear. They weren't repairing the corridor. They were building around it, trying to create a bypass before the state inspectors arrived. I called Ray first, then Daniel, finally Nathan. None of them sounded surprised. Nathan's voice was calm. They're not fixing the problem. They're trying to outrun it. I kept watching the live feed. The crews were working faster than anyone works unless a deadline is about to destroy them. And for the first time since this started, I realized the greatest threat wasn't what had already been buried beneath my ranch. It was what they were willing to bury next, before anyone in government saw the truth. By the time Ray reached my ranch, the contractor convoy had already crossed the south pasture. Daniel Ortiz arrived 10 minutes later in a cooperative truck, still wearing his work shirt. He watched the live camera feed without speaking. Portable light towers illuminated a new trench. Large cable reels sat beside the excavation. Workers moved with the urgency of people racing a deadline instead of following a construction schedule. Daniel finally broke the silence. They're building a bypass. Can it work? I asked. For a while. He zoomed in on the screen, but they're tying new equipment into an overloaded corridor. Nathan Pierce closed the laptop. They're trying to create a different legal argument. What argument? Operational necessity. He looked directly at me. If state inspectors arrive tomorrow and see the bypass already functioning, attorneys will claim the expansion became essential to protect public service. Ray shook his head. They're trying to make an illegal system look too important to shut down. Exactly. I grabbed my truck keys. We're going. When we reached the south corridor, the entire hillside glowed beneath portable floodlights. At least a dozen contractors were working. Excavators, generators, temporary switchgear. Fresh conduit stretched across my pasture like steel snakes disappearing into the earth. Nobody expected us. One worker spotted my truck and immediately stopped what he was doing. Within seconds, every machine shut down. The silence was almost as loud as the equipment had been. Victoria Langford stepped out of the same black SUV. This time she looked tired, not defeated, just exhausted. Grant. I thought state inspectors were coming tomorrow. They are. So why are you digging tonight? We're stabilizing the system. Daniel stepped forward. No. He pointed toward the trench. You're modifying it. Victoria recognized him immediately. Mr. Ortiz, I'm here as an engineer. Then you understand what's at stake. I understand exactly what's at stake. He looked toward the exposed conduit. Who approved this field modification? No answer. He asked again. Was this construction submitted through the cooperative? Another silence. Ray laughed quietly. That's what I thought. Victoria ignored him. She looked at me instead. If this corridor fails tomorrow, 3 communities lose power. Nathan answered before I could. If this corridor keeps operating the way it is, he held up Laura Bennett's inspection notice. State investigators deserve to know why. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time. You don't understand the pressure we're under. I shook my head. I understand the paperwork. She took another step. We've invested hundreds of millions around this lake. And how much did you invest obtaining permission from the landowner? She had no answer. Suddenly, one of the contractors shouted. Everyone turned. A transformer farther down the corridor emitted a deep, metallic groan. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound. Everybody back away. He was already moving before anyone else reacted. We followed him to the transformer enclosure. He pressed his thermal camera against the housing. The display flashed bright red. His face tightened. Temperature's climbing too fast. One contractor spoke up nervously. It was fine an hour ago. Daniel didn't even look at him. Did you connect the new bypass? The man hesitated. Yes. While the existing load stayed energized? Another hesitation. Yes. Daniel exhaled slowly. You just increased demand through equipment that was already overheating. A sharp electrical snap echoed through the night. Not an explosion. Not yet. Just enough to make everyone instinctively step backward. Another contractor pointed upward. Tiny blue arcs danced briefly across one ceramic insulator before disappearing. Ray muttered under his breath, I don't like that. Neither did I. Sheriff Ben Walker arrived minutes later after another resident reported strange lights near the utility corridor. He stepped out of his cruiser, looked at the equipment, then at the exposed trench crossing my ranch. What exactly is going on? Nobody answered. Ben noticed. He turned toward Victoria. You in charge here? She started to speak. Daniel interrupted. I'm requesting immediate suspension of all field work. Why? The equipment is operating outside stable thermal limits. Ben looked from Daniel to the contractors. Is he right? The foreman lowered his eyes. That was answer enough. Ben walked over to the trench. I don't care who hired you. This excavation stops until inspectors get here. Nobody argued. The contractors quietly shut down the remaining generators. One by one, the floodlights went dark, but the transformer kept humming, louder now. Daniel continued watching the thermal display. It isn't cooling. What does that mean? Ben asked. It means the danger didn't leave with the workers. He pointed toward the glowing transformer. It stayed. As we stood there in the darkness, lightning flickered far beyond the western ridge. No rain, just distant flashes. Daniel folded the thermal camera closed. If tomorrow's heat reaches forecast levels, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all understood. The overloaded corridor had reached the point where paperwork alone couldn't protect anyone anymore. As we walked back toward our trucks, my phone buzzed. A weather alert. Extreme heat warning. Record electrical demand expected over the next 48 hours. I looked once more at the transformer still humming above my father's ranch. For weeks we'd been fighting over deeds, easements, and permits. Now another deadline had entered the story. Physics. And unlike lawyers, physics never agrees to extensions. By the next afternoon, Lake Hollow was breaking power demand records. Daniel Ortiz stood beside the monitoring equipment we had set up with Laura Bennett's inspection team. Every few minutes, another reading climbed higher than the last. "The cooling fans haven't cycled once," Daniel said. "They're running at full capacity." Laura looked toward the transformer we'd inspected the night before. "What happens if they stop?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "The equipment keeps heating until something else fails first." Nobody liked that answer. State inspectors had already photographed every unauthorized cabinet crossing my ranch. Survey crews marked the recorded easement with bright orange stakes, and every new installation outside those boundaries was flagged. The evidence was no longer my opinion. It belonged to the state. Just after sunset, another convoy appeared at the south entrance. Not contractors this time. Developers. 2 attorneys, 3 HOA board members, and Victoria Langford. Sheriff Ben Walker intercepted them before they crossed the temporary inspection barrier. "You don't have authorization to enter an active investigation." One attorney held up a folder. "We're requesting emergency access to stabilize public infrastructure." Laura stepped forward. "This corridor is already under regulatory review." The attorney smiled politely. "Our engineers believe immediate modifications are necessary." Daniel shook his head. "No." Everyone turned toward him. "Any modification under this load increases the risk." Victoria finally spoke. "If nothing changes tonight, thousands of residents could lose electricity." Daniel answered without raising his voice. "If something changes tonight, they could lose much more than that." The discussion ended when another alarm sounded from the monitoring trailer. One inspector called out. Transformer 3 just exceeded its safe operating range. Daniel hurried inside. I followed. The thermal display showed one section glowing white. Not orange, not red. White. Daniel stared for only a second before grabbing his radio. "We've got rapid thermal escalation." Laura immediately contacted the Regional Operations Center. Within minutes, the response came back. "Continue monitoring. Do not disconnect. Executive authorization pending." Daniel lowered the radio slowly. "They're still debating." Ray looked at the display. "They don't have time." Outside, the air carried a sharp metallic smell. Daniel noticed it first. Ozone. He was already moving toward the transformer. We reached the enclosure just as a loud electrical crack echoed across the hillside. Tiny blue arcs jumped between 2 insulators. The grass beneath the structure began smoking. One state inspector shouted, "We've got ignition!" Fire crews rushed forward but stopped several yards away. The equipment was still energized. Nobody could safely approach it. Laura grabbed her radio again. "Request emergency shutdown authorization." The answer took far too long. "Await confirmation. Stand by." Daniel looked at me. "They're afraid of shutting down 3 neighborhoods." Another arc exploded overhead. The small grass fire spread another few feet. Sheriff Ben Walker stared at the flames. "They're waiting on lawyers?" Nathan answered quietly. "They're waiting on liability." I looked toward the emergency disconnect assembly standing 50 yards away. I knew that equipment. I'd operated systems like it for decades. One pull would isolate the corridor. One pull would black out every neighborhood connected to it. Victoria hurried toward us. "Grant!" I turned. "If you disconnect that line, you'll shut down Copper Ridge, Juniper Shores, and Canyon Reserve." "I know. People will blame you. They already do." Her voice cracked for the first time. "There has to be another way." Daniel didn't even look away from the transformer. "There isn't." Another violent arc flashed across the insulators. The fire widened beneath the steel structure. Ben looked toward me. "If you know how to do this." He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. I walked to the emergency equipment cabinet. Inside hung the same arc flash suit I'd requested inspectors keep on site after reviewing the corridor. Heavy jacket, insulated gloves, face shield. I put them on one piece at a time. No speeches, no dramatic moment. Just procedure. Exactly the way I'd been trained. Daniel handed me the insulated hot stick. "Once you commit, I know. There's no halfway." I nodded once. Victoria stood frozen behind the safety line. "Grant, please." I stopped for only a second. "You can rebuild power." I looked toward the growing fire beneath the transformer. "You don't rebuild lives." Then I stepped to the disconnect. I locked the fiberglass hook onto the operating lever, pulled. The mechanism slammed open with a deafening metallic crack. A brilliant arc flashed across the switchgear. Then, silence. The transformer stopped humming. The blue arcing vanished. Within seconds, the flames beneath the structure began dying, without energized equipment feeding the heat. Across the valley, lights disappeared one neighborhood after another. Gate systems shut down. Marinas went dark. The shoreline became a ribbon of black stretching around Lake Hollow. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. Every person standing there understood the same thing. 3 luxury neighborhoods had just lost power, but an overloaded corridor had stopped fighting itself. As firefighters finished extinguishing the last burning grass, Laura Bennett looked at the now silent transformer. Then at me. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "everyone's going to know why this happened." I looked across the dark valley. They're finally going to know what was buried under my ranch. By sunrise, every television truck in the county was parked outside Lake Hollow. The headlines were simple. 3 luxury neighborhoods lose power after emergency shutdown. The reporters had the outage. They didn't have the reason. That changed before noon. Laura Bennett's inspection team spent 6 straight hours documenting every unauthorized installation crossing my property. Each cabinet received an evidence tag. Each underground junction was mapped against the original 1974 easement. Daniel Ortiz opened transformer housings one by one while state engineers photographed scorched insulation, overloaded transfer equipment, and cooling systems that had been running beyond their intended limits. Nobody argued anymore. The evidence spoke louder than any attorney. Around midday, Nathan Pierce received the first official engineering disclosure from the Electric Cooperative. He read it twice before sliding it across my kitchen table. "You should see page 4. The report listed every undocumented upgrade discovered during the emergency inspection. Commercial switching assemblies, additional underground feeders, unapproved balancing equipment. None of it appeared in the cooperative's original filings. More importantly, none of it matched the easement my father had signed." Daniel pointed to another section. "This one's worse." 3 years earlier, an internal engineering review had recommended replacing the entire corridor before additional development around Lake Hollow continued. The recommendation had been marked, Deferred pending development expansion. No replacement. No disclosure. No notice to homeowners. Just another delay. Nathan leaned back quietly. They knew. Nobody answered. We didn't need to. The paperwork already had. That afternoon, the first leak reached the news. Someone inside the development company released internal emails. One message from an engineering consultant warned that continued expansion without a new transmission route could overload the agricultural corridor. Victoria Langford's reply appeared directly beneath it. Delay major infrastructure upgrades until refinancing is complete. Temporary modifications remain acceptable. I stared at the screen. Ray shook his head. They weren't solving the problem. They were financing around it. The story exploded. Insurance companies announced emergency reviews of every policy covering Copper Ridge, Juniper Shores, and Canyon Reserve. Several lenders temporarily froze pending construction loans. Developers canceled public sales events. Residents demanded emergency HOA meetings. By evening, videos from those meetings filled every local news station. Homeowners who had spent a week calling me greedy were now demanding answers from their own board members. One man held up a copy of the leaked engineering report. You told us everything was inspected. Nobody answered him. Another woman asked why the HOA had continued approving new homes if the electrical corridor had already exceeded its intended capacity. Again, silence. Late that night, Sheriff Ben Walker called. You still awake? I doubt anybody in this county is sleeping. He laughed once. Fair point. Then his voice became serious. We've received requests for financial records tied to the developments. From who? State investigators. He paused. And insurance fraud investigators. That wasn't something anyone had expected when this began. The issue had started as an easement dispute. Now it had become a question of disclosure. The following morning, Victoria Langford resigned. The announcement lasted less than 2 minutes. She cited personal reasons. Nobody believed it. By then, too many documents had already become public. Emails, inspection summaries, engineering recommendations, meeting minutes discussing how to avoid alarming homeowners before refinancing closed. Nathan closed his laptop. The blackout didn't destroy them. The documents did. Ray nodded. They spent years hiding the truth. And one morning the paperwork caught up. A week later, Daniel stopped by the ranch after attending a regulatory hearing. He looked exhausted. The state isn't asking whether the corridor was overloaded anymore. What are they asking? Who knew? He set another binder on the table. And when? Those 2 questions changed everything. Developers blamed consultants. Consultants blamed contractors. Contractors blamed the HOA. The HOA blamed utility coordination. Everyone suddenly remembered only part of the story. No one wanted ownership of the whole one. That evening I stood on the porch watching the darkened corridor stretch across my ranch. The transformers were silent. The unauthorized construction had stopped. For the first time in weeks, nobody was asking me to sign anything. Nobody was offering money. Nobody was threatening lawsuits. Because everyone finally understood the same thing. The blackout had lasted only 9 hours. The paper trail would last forever. And once government investigators finished following every signature, no amount of expensive landscaping around Lake Hollow would be able to bury the truth again. The lawsuits began before electricity was fully restored. Not one lawsuit. Dozens. Insurance carriers sued developers. Homeowners sued HOA boards. The electric cooperative filed claims against contractors who had installed undocumented equipment. State regulators ordered every unauthorized section of the corridor was placed under emergency control. For the first time since my father's funeral, nobody was arguing about whether the easement mattered. Everyone accepted that it did. 2 weeks later, heavy equipment returned to my ranch. But this convoy looked different. Every truck carried state permits. Every worker signed in. Survey crews marked each section before excavation. Nothing happened at night. Nothing happened without documentation. Ray watched the first illegal switching cabinet being lifted from the ground. He shook his head. They spent years hiding that. I watched the crane swing it onto a trailer. Took one morning to remove it. Over the next 3 months, every unauthorized installation crossing my ranch disappeared. Commercial transfer cabinets, underground feeder lines, improvised balancing equipment. Everything outside the original easement came out of the ground. The damaged pasture was reseeded. Fence lines were rebuilt. The south corridor slowly began looking like my father's ranch again. Daniel Ortiz visited often during the reconstruction. One afternoon, he unfolded a new set of engineering plans across the hood of his truck. They finally approved a permanent transmission route. I studied the map. The new line ran east of Lake Hollow across legally acquired utility property. Every permit had been approved. Every environmental review completed. Every landowner compensated before construction began. I smiled. So this is how it should have been done. Daniel nodded. It always should have. The legal fight ended quietly. There was no dramatic courtroom speech, no surprise witness. The developers settled before trial. Nathan explained why while we sat at my kitchen table. They requested mediation. That fast? They know discovery would become public. He closed the settlement folder. Paying millions is cheaper than letting every email appear in open court. The agreement required full removal of the illegal infrastructure, financial compensation for the unauthorized use of my property, restoration of the ranch, and funding for future corridor inspections. Victoria Langford resigned permanently from every HOA position. Several development executives lost their professional licenses. Multiple regulatory penalties followed. Justice arrived the same way my father always said it would. One document at a time. Months later, the new transmission corridor was energized. From the ridge above Lake Hollow, my daughter and I watched the lights return across the valley. One neighborhood lit up, then another. Finally, the third. Security gates reopened. Streetlights reflected across the lake. Marinas came back to life. Everything worked, legally, safely. She looked across the shoreline for a long time before speaking. So, who really caused the blackout? I didn't answer immediately. I looked toward the place where the illegal corridor had once crossed my father's ranch. Fresh grass covered the disturbed ground. You'd never know millions of dollars in hidden infrastructure had been buried there. The man who pulled the switch? She asked. I smiled. No. She waited. The blackout happened because too many people kept pretending a broken system wasn't broken. She nodded slowly. They thought they had more time. Exactly. We sat there until the last glow of sunset disappeared behind the hills. For the first time in months, the valley hummed with power that belonged where it was. No hidden easements, no secret construction, no late-night trenching, no expensive lies buried beneath someone else's land. Just a legal transmission line serving the communities it was built for. As we packed our chairs, I looked one last time across the quiet shoreline. My father used to tell me that land remembers everything. He was right. It remembers who respected it. It remembers who tried to take shortcuts. And eventually, it tells the truth. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through records, patience, and the simple fact that no amount of money can rewrite a deed. The 3 neighborhoods got their electricity back. I got my ranch back, and Lake Hollow finally rested on a foundation that didn't require anyone to lie anymore.
If they want lesson, this is part of music. It is Small compromise have a way of becoming very big problem when the party is willing to face them honestly. The document might productive the patient to gather facts instead of making accusations, and the willingness to let the judge speak for itself ended up protecting far more than my land. They protect family from a dangerous system that should have been fixed years early. Something doing the right thing isn't the first part, and it certainly isn't the easier. But it gives everyone the patron to move forward with confidence instead of certainty. I think that whether you are talking about a rent, a neighborhood, or any place people can harm, real strength isn't found in shooting the loudest. It's found in standing firm, respecting the law, and refusing to trade what right for what convenient. In the end, communities are strongest when just impure on honey instead of soft cut. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Are you believe standing your ground with fresh is always work? Try yes in the comment, and if you ever have an experience with an HOA, a property dispute, or neighbor who tested your patent, say your story below. I read as many comments as I can, and your experience often inspire future story. If you enjoy this story and want more story about rent life, property rights, and ordinary people standing quiet, courage, it'd be honored if you subscribe and join us for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thank you for spending time with me today.